Hi, this is Paul. Paul Kingsnorth has written a response to a whole bunch of responses, to which Bethel McGrew has another response. Bethel messaged me and said, "The infinite Paul Kingsnorth response loop is getting out of hand." I don't think so, because I think the reason Paul's talk struck a nerve is because it's a nexus of a whole bunch of things we're trying to work through that aren't being immediately connected. I did this video today. I loved the thumbnail. And that points out that the civilizational Christianity, the how then shall we live, I did my sermon on the Plain. All of these things are coming together right now as we're sort of having ingested the Protestant Reformation, and in some ways, some aspects of the Protestant Reformation have, I think, decisively triumphed, while other aspects, perhaps those aspects most cherished by certain confessional Protestant reformers, are struggling. And the Protestant Reformation was this massive thing that resulted in a whole bunch of different things. Boy, what a terrible sentence! Massive thing that resulted in a whole bunch of different things. Why don't you say something that means something, Vanderclay? I did a cut. That's not too much of a cut. It's still an hour long, but from a 3-hour video, an hour's not bad. What CW said has haunted me. So let's play a little bit of it.
All institutional churches within Christianity as maybe more properly understood as parachurch organizations. So in a way, I've kind of like deeply imbibed the ethos of something of emergent church, even though they were kind of like, the basement dwellers of Big Eva or something, perhaps. But yeah, I think that the institution is something the church does and not something it is. And so along the lines of what Tripp was getting at, I think the larger question, I wonder, for unironically Christian people in this cultural moment is, what is the underlying unity that serves as a kind of identifiable continuity in all this diverse Christian stuff, whether it be like the formal, speculative, in my view, theological product, or the socio-cultural phenomenon of how we practice our faith.
Now, Kingsnorth isn't answering the question about the church. And in fact, I would argue that Kingsnorth, part of the weakness of even his response is that there's almost no place for the church in his response. Well, one of the things that I coined around the time of that, maybe even during that live stream, was this, I think it was a little bit before, industrial Christianity. When you look at someone like Ivan Illich, it's sort of against industrial Christianity. Now, I talked quite a bit about the monastic movement in my rough draft for Sunday, which I replayed at the end of this video. And so Paul begins by saying, yeah, I caused quite a stir. He has the link to his conversation with Peugeot up top. I should probably watch it again, but I don't really think, I don't think he and Jonathan really sort of got at it in their conversation. I don't think they wanted to sort of square off. And I don't think they had reason to square off. Basically, my understanding of Peugeot's critique of against Christian civilization is that what happens with the monastics is that monastics seed civilization. That was part of the point of my sermon. Wow, third round for a sermon for me. That's quite a bit. Because what happens with the monastic movement. Now, it's important to recognize that the monastic movement is 2 centuries after the age of the apostles. And there's been a restorationist impulse within Christianity right from the beginning. And it is sort of seeded by the fact that Jesus basically says, if you knew Moses, if you really knew Moses, you would know me. And so while Jesus is definitely pouring new wine into new wineskins, Jesus also makes, and I made this the point in the sermon the week before in the Gospel of Luke, Jesus makes the point that what the Lord is doing through Jesus is a continuation and fulfillment of what the Lord started in creation with Abraham and with Moses. That's, of course, there's a big debate in terms of, with many of our Jewish friends with respect to that. But that's essentially what Jesus says in terms of him being Messiah. And this is very much against the Marcionite impulse of trying to split up the work of Paul of Tarsus and even Luke, which was the only gospel that I believe Marcion would accept, from the work of Israel. Because what happens when St. Anthony goes into the cave is sort of like what happens when Forrest Gump starts jogging. It's that people are inspired. They're inspired by the sacrificial quality of the display. And so, well, is the cave right next to St. Anthony? I'll go there. And another one there. And before you know it, people are giving money and people are building churches. And as Peugeot said, the asceticism of the monastics becomes the seed of civilization. And I would argue that the seed is in fact planted by Jesus, and it's planted in the Sermon on the Mount. And if there's any aspect of Jesus' ministry that Paul Kingsnorth, I think, successfully triggered in his talk against civilization, it is exactly that spirit of the Sermon on the Plain in Luke chapter 6, which not only has the Beatitudes, the stripped down Beatitudes, harder to spiritualize Beatitudes of Luke 6. Blessed are the poor, blessed are the hungry, blessed are people when they hate you. Rejoice and be glad. And so, I ran all through these things in my rough draft for Sunday. And so, of course, John Vervaeke would be anxious by this because he probably feels a sort of dualism coming here. But Paul does not want to, Paul is not looking for a dualism. Now, so he starts by addressing some of his critics, points to James Scott and Jacques Ellul, who of course have made these points in previous generations. He has complaints again about Jordan Peterson and Ark, and again, I think if we can talk about not only institutional Christianity, but industrial Christianity. I think it is industrial Christianity that Paul really has a problem with. But, again, in my rough draft and in my sermon, I emphasize that there are some huge tensions in Jesus' sermon. As I mentioned before, when Jesus has 5,000 men plus women and children a ways away from the towns around the Sea of Galilee, and the hour is getting late, and they recognize that there are women and children and some men who probably will need a meal, Jesus tells to his disciples, you feed them. And of course, they're bumbling around with 5 loaves and 2 fish. And at that point, Jesus doesn't say, give the 5 loaves and 2 fish to whoever wants them. Blessed are the hungry. Jesus doesn't say that. He feeds them. And when Jesus' mother comes and says, they've run out of wine, now is not the hour, but then he turns water into wine. And so he multiplies loaves and fish. He turns water into wine. When he runs across a beggar who is lame or blind, Jesus doesn't say, blessed are you who beg by the side of the road, for yours is the kingdom of heaven. Well, actually it's true, but what happens in terms of the miracle is he begins to deliver a sample, a witness of the kingdom of heaven to the blind beggar, how he gets his sight. And so the Beatitudes and the woes have to be understood, obviously, within the full context of Jesus' ministry that is pointing to Jesus' kingdom, which is here and not here, which is now and not yet, which is among us and yet to come, and all of those tensions. And so then you have the question, okay, well, how then shall we live? Because that's what Paul is wrestling. He's wrestling with how shall we live? How shall we bear witness to Jesus here and now? And as you go through, he certainly hears some of the knocks, and he noted the podcast that I had picked up on and put here, and then he much more seriously engages with Peter Leithart's response. And of course, Peter Leithart is a very serious Christian thinker, someone that you can't just sort of push away. And yet, in the end, I think Paul sticks to his guns. And again, I don't have a problem with Paul sticking to his guns, partly because I think part of what has happened we are in the age of synthesis, as Spencer Clavin said, and each of us does have to synthesize, but I think part of how the body of Christ works is that there are St. Anthony's, and there are Cyprians, and there are Chrysostoms, and there are Martin Luthers, and there are C.S. Lewis's, and there are Justinians, and there are Constantines, and there are Queen Elizabeths, and the kingdom of the body of Christ has all these manifestations, none of them perfect save Christ himself. And even as a Protestant, I don't have a problem with noticing that particular Christians throughout history have performed exceptional duty and borne exceptional witness, but as been noted often, a very strange thing about the saints are their diverse excellencies spread amongst each other, whereas it seems that only Christ seems to manage containing all the diverse excellencies within himself. This is something pointed to by Jonathan Edwards, the great colonial theologian and philosopher in the Reformed faith, and he pointed to by Tim Keller. And I've used that diverse excellencies point many, many times in many of my sermons. Because Jesus is a monastic who preaches in the city, and Jesus does all of these things. He doesn't stay in the cave. Now, I know that some monastics are preaching orders, but very quickly, once you have more people than St. Anthony, and once you have 2 or 3 St. Anthony's, and you have a rule, you have already crossed the threshold of industrial Christianity, where there is a rule or a law that is in some way above the people, impinging on them to live a certain way. Now, one of the things that people might think, well, each of us should live as Christ calls us to. Amen. Will we all be different? In some ways, yes. How should we know how we should live? And now Kingsnorth clearly looks at the scriptures and the church. And again, as I said before, I think certain aspects of the Protestant Reformation have decisively conquered. And the fact that Paul, I'm certainly certain he asks his priest and consults his priest, and that I think is exactly what he should do. He also asks the question publicly. And we all sort of get to play along. And I think rightfully so. I think he does a service to the church. I think he's doing the right thing. And I think he's doing the right thing to continue to struggle publicly with these questions, because the tensions that Jesus creates in the Sermon on the Plain and the Sermon on the Mount is like this mass of tremendous spiritual gravity that just keeps pulling us, and it won't just let us sit on our fat, affluent, wealthy Western haunches. It was, in fact, that gravity that drew all of that gold and all of that wealth into the monasteries that created the crisis of the monastery that was revisited perpetually. Of course, the Franciscans visit, and every new monastic movement is going to somehow try to approximate, to cross the asymptote, and to finally, in this world, embody fully and purely the kingdom of God. And it cannot happen, because I think one of the enduring messages of the gospel is, in fact, that this current age, this dispensation that we live in, the age of decay, cannot fully embody the kingdom of heaven, which is why Christ will return with a new age that can. And until that happens, we all live with that tension. And that gravitational seed that launched the monastic movement 2 centuries after the apostles, and that's been revisited and reworked, and of course monk Martin Luther reworked it again, and the Renovare movement and Dallas Willard, we've continued to rework it. And Protestant missionaries, of course, in Protestantism, foreign missionaries that go overseas and are martyred and die for their faith and live sacrificially with their families, are sort of a version of Protestant monastics. They are the athletes of evangelicalism and have been for a long time. But again, all of this, and recently one was on Chad's channel, and I watched the dynamics develop there. Now, of course, I've lived those dynamics and I felt those dynamics. And so I also know how, as with the monastic movement, the foreign missionary movement has these senses which that they feel the gravitation of this seed so fully. But I remember when Viv Grigg, he was a missionary to the Philippines, and unlike normal missionary service, he went to live in a Philippine, did they even call it a favela, even though that's the Brazilian word? He lived in the Philippine slums and lived like the Philippine poor and lived simply. He did all of it. He was an evangelical foreign missionary, monastic in Protestantism. And I remember just being so inspired by that as a seminarian. And was I married yet? And of course, I was dating a woman that became my wife, and we'd become foreign missionaries and all of that. But I was so drawn to that. And Roger Greenway, our missions teacher, he had to sit back and, because he had also been a foreign missionary, so he had done the tour. And he just said a number of things like, well, when he got sick, he had this American passport. He could pull out. He could, if he would get really sick, would his supporters actually let him die? And you might say, well, yes, the true saints, they would just die. And the point I made in my sermon, of course, this is happening in secular society here in Sacramento. Every now and then you see somebody with a saffron robe, and people in Sacramento are like, ooh. They don't do that when they see a nun in her habit or a priest in his collar, because, well, watch the children. There's all these contexts that we're embedded in. But let's see, what point? You kind of, the monastics, part of the problem about the monastics was you just can't keep it a secret. Sort of like Forrest Gump jogging. And people are inspired and they want to follow. So this issue is deeply tied to the question of civilizational Christianity, as Paul noted in the title of his piece. And it's deeply related to the question of, well, how on earth do politics and religion relate? Again, politics is now, religion is always. If you believe that the government or the state of affairs should somehow reflect your Christian values, deep inside, there's probably a little Democrat, and I don't mean a Democrat versus Republican, but someone with a democratic impulse saying, I should get the right to vote. And even implicit is, well, should we be environmentalists? Because the difficulty is you're going to have trouble never crossing that threshold of industrial Christianity. Because very quickly, if you're concerned about the state of the oceans and the state of the air and the state of the wildlife and the animals, and you're asking civilizational, institutional, scalable questions, already you are there. And if, in fact, you are not simply going to be a saint that goes into a cave and nobody ever hears about it, where did you get the scriptures? Of course, the Protestants, that's a if you go too radically down this road, and again, so Paul sort of, in my talk in October, a woman came up to me and we got talking, and she said something then that I think I'll always remember. It's a good thing that the Gospels were written down so early during the lifetime of those who knew Jesus, because otherwise later Christians, the comfortable ones, would have certainly censored it. And she's right. They're too disturbing. She's right. But again, the apostles weren't monastics. Paul says Peter traveled with his wife. And now the apostles became martyrs, and there's certainly, I can very clearly see how you get to monasticism from the martyrdom of the apostles. But to get back to C.W.'s point, I mean, the question that he phrases right at the beginning is so right and so pure. And I'll play I'll put the, because I know I've got so many videos on my channel, it's hard to find them. So I'll just take this CW clip and I'll put it at the end of my current rantings.
But I tend to think of like all institutional churches within Christianity as maybe more properly understood as parachurch organizations. So in a way, I've kind of like deeply imbibed the ethos of something of emergent church, even though they were kind of...
And again, you know, there's a lot that you can say, and wait till you see the whole video with Wokal Distance. There's a lot you can say as to whether or not Peugeot and Peterson have actually, especially Peterson, has sort of separated his politics from his religion, especially after he puts out a video today which basically says, Alberta should cut a deal with Trump and become part of the United States, maybe. And I thought it was a wow. We live in amazing times. But CW's barking up this tree. And it comes out of the Emergent movement. And CW is exactly right. All of these impulses. Part of what the young, restless, and reformed, not them as quite as much, but part of what the emergent impulse was is they looked at the seeker church and said, this is industrial Christianity, and we should leave it behind. And again, it was many of the emergent that got into the Renovare and the spiritual disciplines, and they were in many ways quite metagelical. They were looking to orthodoxy, and they were looking to liturgy, and they're looking to all of these things. That's what the emergents were doing. And they're asking deep questions about wine and wineskins.
Like, you know, the basement dwellers of Big Eva or something, perhaps.
You know, even that, the basement dwellers of Big Eva. These are the young men in their mother's basements who their mothers maybe went to the evangelical church and they couldn't stand it, and so they could deconstruct it and listen to Sam Harris and blah, 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 and then Jordan Peterson sort of turned a light on for them, and, you know, some of them have found the TLC.
But yeah, I think that the institution is something the church does and not something it is. And so along the lines of what...
And right there. It's something the church does and not something it is. And of course, anybody who's worked in this has an understanding of sort of the organic church versus the institutional church. And, you know, I'm not ready to go quite as far as CW in that, but part of what you begin to wonder as you go through this is, okay, Paul, is the church also too far? Because again, you know, and later in the video, I'll say, you know, this question gets put out there, and now this question got put out there by the Jesus people and by many others. You know, did Jesus intend to start a church? Perhaps arguments like these come down in the end to what kind of Christ we see. You're right. We're all familiar with statements like Jesus is Lord or Christ is King. But what sort of Lord? What sort of King? I see a kingship which turns all worldly notions of power upside down. And again, part of what Wokal was impressing to me in our conversation was that in some ways, if you start with your politics and that becomes your frame, then that becomes the filter through which you read Scripture. Now, all of us read Scripture through a filter, but this sort of, let's see, how did Wokal say it? Oh yeah, the critique of mass society. Maybe I'll have to take a little, keep an eye on the time, take a little clip of Wokal and put it in here too. Because Nietzsche thought that Christ, and by implications Christians, are weaklings for this reason, in a worldly terms. Jesus' earthly kingship was indeed a flop. And of course, Jews and Muslims might look at that too. A great prophet, maybe a rabbi with important things to say, but a flop. Well, then you have to ask, well, what is Christendom? And the tensions are all over the place. And the truth is that every time I hear someone say, well, orthodoxy says, I think, is that any more disciplined? Probably some more than Protestantism says, because the Orthodox themselves seem to be wildly all over the map. And many will tell me, that's a feature, not a bug. And I'll say, okay, so it's difficult to say Protestantism says, except to a narrow little band. We ended up abandoning all but 12 of his, he ended up abandoned by all but 12 of his followers. No, not really. The women and John were at the cross and the followers were hiding, but very quickly you have the 72 and the 120 and, but yeah, abandoned. Very, very true. But only semi-abandoned. They were cowards. But then came the event which turned all power on its head, the event which painted in every new colors everything that he had been saying about the sacrifice, ruling by serving, self-emptying, and leaving behind the values of the world. What sort of king is this? A wandering king, a peasant king, a desert king, a king who rules by serving, a king who washes the feet of his subject. And again, amen, amen, amen. We all know the stories. Christianity turns power on its head, and it's not the same as rejecting power. It is indeed transforming it. God's power is not human power, our petty. And so when St. Anthony goes into the cave, power, that gravitation of the gravitational force of the Sermon on the Mount and the Sermon on the Plain, there's power there. And it keeps transforming. But it tries to instantiate itself in institutions, even in industrial Christianity, and just like you can have your argument as to whether St. Anthony alone in the cave is purer than an Orthodox church. But I would argue Christianity is in both, and Jesus is in both. I can write these words, but I'm not really sure I understand them. Amen. I certainly don't practice them. And there it is. He's feeling the pull. He feels the tug. But he's got a wife. And he's got children. And he's got responsibilities. And he's got a job. And he's not a priest. And he's not a monastic. How then shall he live? And this was, of course, this is Luther's question. This is the question of Christians throughout the ages. Christ is not established anywhere. He becomes a stranger, a beggar, and a vagabond, writes John Chrysostom, to tell us that no institution in the present is eternal. True. That his kingdom is neither of this world nor imposed on this world with worldly weapons. You're going to have to deal with eschatology. And so but the kingdom is present there in the institution of the church. And this is, again, elements of Protestantism are pervasive in that it was the Protestants that said the church is invisible. And of course, the Roman Catholic Church of its day, its adversary, said, no, we are it. It is here embodied in us. And the Protestants said, Calvin and Luther, well, Calvin, went to great pains to say the church is still in the Church of Rome, despite its failings. And the church is still in many churches, despite their failings. But, yeah. This age cannot purely contain the kingdom. We bear witness to it, but all of that struggling over institutions, trying to spread it without industrializing it. Well, I think it in fact spreads without the industry, but it even colonizes and sneaks into and uses the industry. And Jesus is smuggling himself through the world in how many different ways? And yet there is always that gap. There is always that gap in this age. That gap that drives true Christians to their knees and into prayer and to weeping and mourning. Maybe I should do a short version of this and a long version. I don't know. But I praise God for Paul Kingsnorth and this conversation and the people who have answered him and the people who are frustrated by him and the people who, because this is the engine by which Christ continues to renew and purify and reform her church. Wave after wave after wave of sometimes monastics and sometimes anti-monastics and some reforming efforts that go horribly wrong. That gravitational call of Christ just it won't let us go. And praise God for that. So, all right. So I think I will do a shorter version of this, of just my rantings, and then I'll add another version with all of the appendix material. Leave a comment.
There's an article that I call this the greatest article in history. It's called Environmentality. And it's a radical Marxist who attacks the climate change and the global green movement. And so he says we need a review of the dangers of environmentality in the era of climate change. So he says there's discursive frames are placed around the planet's population. The practices of environmentality essentially impose a full eco-managerial grid on the earth. Managing global climate change on one hand is central preoccupation for many government networks, and the apparent urgency of acting decisively to reduce greenhouse gases gives the scientific experts and green NGOs involved in this project a new collective morality, ethics, a common aesthetics, and the production of new scientific studies. In this vein, green globalism motives many to enact beliefs and practices that presume each state, society, and culture must be managed along the lines of a corporate capitalist enterprise. Continuing, as a result, one asks if political agendas are largely what the global climate change science is all about. Environmentality relies upon these apparatuses of resource managerialism and systemic surveillance to produce its governance effects. Climatology, then, is not a closed and certain system of discovery, and it is being challenged from many sides. Like any science, its theory and practice represent a will to knowledge that is anonymous and susceptible to transformations. Nevertheless, the green movement's relentless policing of everyday life, what light bulbs to buy, what foods to eat, what clothes to wear, how to commute, what sort of shelter to inhabit, represents another proliferation of governance theories. This is a Foucaultian Marxist who takes the critical theory thing, applies it to green globalism, and ends up sounding like a right-wing climate denier. And why is that? Because that entire apparatus only ever got applied to right-wing things because the people who invented it were all on the left. They didn't realize that could be turned around and shot right back at them, which is what you're seeing on the political right.
Yep. Yep.
There, you're seeing this come right back. And so this critical theoretical apparatus goes in all directions.
Yep.
Just like the critique of mass society goes in all directions.
Yep.
Everyone else is now just trying to position themselves
Yep.
and say, you're the mainstream. No, you're the mainstream.
Yep.
No, you're in the center. No, we're
Yep.
the rebels. You want to rebel? Have a child and get married, right? It's all framed in terms of this.
Yep.
The critical theory and the politics. This is why on the left of the deconstructors, not a single one of them ever deconstructed their Calvinist faith and came up having the same sexual ethics as Aquinas. That never happened.
Yep.
Nobody said, look, I had to deconstruct my charismatic Pentecostal upbringing, and you know what I find myself believing? The sexual morality of Augustine was right. Nobody ever says that.
Right.
Not a single person ever deconstructed themselves into the sexual ethics
But I
of the
think
church
that's
fathers.
exactly what they're doing, even if they're not saying it, because they can't say it. And part of what we're seeing with the utilitrads and this movement towards traditional Christianity is exactly that. And the real question is, because you can't, if you watch them, you're not going to be able to know what's at the heart of it. And so the real question is going to be, what will the next generation do? Because again, children watch our eyes, not our lips.
Thank you for being here. I really appreciate it. So I was watching a few of your interviews in preparation for this, and I heard you speak about religion quite a bit. And if you look up what religion means in the Webster Dictionary, you get something like a system of faith centered on a supernatural being or beings or something like that. Mm. But I've heard you use religion to describe things like punk rockers, for example, that's a religious experience. So my first question would be, how do you define what is considered religious? And then sort of as a follow-up to that, if, say, Sam Harris...
Religious is what you act out.
What's that?
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or
No, I didn't say
supernatural
that.
beings?
No.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to do with those?
No, it probably necessarily has to do with it too, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. You know, like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, you know, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, you know, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe. Now, in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms. And the probability that you understand them is very low, because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense. But that doesn't take away from what you've... that doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
As one final thing, so when you and, say, Sam Harris argue about religion, you're arguing about fundamentally different things, it sounds like. His conception of what is religious is very different from yours.
Yeah, well, he tends to think of religious thought the same way that a smart 13-year-old atheist thinks about a fundamentalist Christian. It's like, yeah, okay, you're just not getting to the heart of the matter. You know, and I just finished reading all of Sam's books in the last couple of weeks, and as far as I'm concerned, he doesn't ever get to the bottom of the issue. He doesn't address the fundamental thinkers. There are some profound thinkers. Dostoevsky's one, Tolstoy, Nietzsche, Jung. It's like they're completely absent from, and the same with Dawkins. It's completely absent. All that conceptualization is completely absent from their corpus of works. They don't even have an understanding for the psychological utility of religion. And it's a big problem. You know, you don't get to be an atheist when the people you attack are like naive fundamentalists. And I have some sympathy for the naive fundamentalists. It's like what they're basically saying is something like this. Look, we have an ethos that's valuable. You scientist types are casually dismantling it. What the hell are we supposed to do? Well, the fundamentalists don't know what to do about that, so they say, well, creationism is science. It's like, well, no, it's not. But that doesn't mean that they don't have a point. Their point is there's something valuable here. It's like, don't break it casually. What are you going to replace it with? The new atheists wish that everybody becomes rational. It's like, yeah, sure, that's going to happen.
The catchphrase I say go to church. And what I mean by that is, in some ways, you have to engage in the human relationships around you. That's like the best way to go about that. You know, you have relationship, you have a family, you have some kind of community around you, and so that's the best place to go, because in some ways that's the place that will have this procedural aspect to it that will ground the other stuff. You know, it's like if you have to, you know, to help your kids with their homework, or you have to do this kind of really grounded stuff that has very little to do with the ideology. You get engaged in other people's lives, then it binds you in a different way, right? It binds you.
And then like my father would, he was going to church, and I wasn't really living with him, but he was going to church, and he would like kind of, those are elements of this conversation. Is I got to go to church.
It's being part of a church is part of Christian discipleship, and in that word discipleship, there's this word discipline, which is it's a discipline to go to church.
What would be so great about actually going to a church is like you start going to a church so that when you do need like to be prayed for, when you have something to be prayed for about, you have a place to just say that.
You're dead on right, Grizz, and that is what the church is for. To know and be known, to love and be loved, to have a place to go where people can pray for you, where they will welcome you in. And this is, again, part of why I want churches to have estuaries, because it is, I know that it is difficult in many churches for people to, in a sense, come in and bring their real self. And what I mean by that is have to say what's on their mind, or you can't wrestle with them. It's like, so Plato, as John reminds us, is broad, so he's a wrestler. You can't wrestle over a screen. So maybe if it's paintball for Jesus, maybe it should be wrestling with Plato. Because, and in church, in a real space, now often it doesn't happen, I understand that, but at least there's a chance to actually have a relationship with grit. And that's part of why churches are local, they're relational, they're face-to-face, they're in real life.
Said about why would young people want to go to church, and I feel like I want to have some kind of dynamic message or something that if they do find some reason to come, I'm trying to fish, so I'm throwing bait and I'm trying to hook somebody. And it's what Paul is doing too. He said about being evangelical. It's evangelism of some sort.
Well, fishers of men is
yes.
Is the promise, yes?
Yes, correct.
It's possessed. We did go to church today. I took communion.
I don't go to church to think or to rationalize God. I go to church to worship him. Right? And that's, I'm happy with that. I'm very happy with that. And afterwards, during coffee hour, we can all argue about the God of our understanding, right? Yeah.
But I think you're right. I think that the wild twin, the thing that led to my sort of dawning to consciousness of Christianity was a 101-day vigil that I did in forest. And I went into the forest.
You don't have to go crazy.
Yeah.
You actually have to go, you have to humble yourself and and do it right here, right now, right?
Get up. I like how Father Schmemann talks about it for the life of the world. He says it starts when you get up and get ready and you walk or you go to church. You start those are simple. I get up, I brush my teeth, I take a shower, I put on clothes, I go, the things of life, and we're ascending up into heaven.
But I tend to think of all institutional churches within Christianity as maybe more properly understood as parachurch organizations. So in a way, I've kind of deeply imbibed the ethos of something of Emergent church, even though they were kind of the basement dwellers of Big Eva or something, perhaps. But yeah, I think that the institution is something the church does and not something it is. And so along the lines of what Tripp was getting at, I think the larger question, I wonder, for unironically Christian people in this cultural moment is, what is the underlying unity that serves as a kind of identifiable continuity in all this diverse Christian stuff, whether it be the formal, speculative, in my view, theological product, or the sociocultural phenomenon of how we practice our faith. What is the continuity? What's the underlying unity? Or maybe a skeptic might ask, is there a there? That's what I'm interested in.
I'm just gonna pause and say that's how to pitch. That's how to pitch. Nicely done, CW. Nicely done. I will point to what CW said because there are some parallels here in terms of sort of the civilizational Christianity, and I think the Emergent movement was deeply about industrial Christianity. And so when CW said all churches are parachurch organizations, and I think especially in the Protestant world, and just the video I made this morning, which of course got a little spicy for some people, when I basically said, and that was as I was watching Nathan Jacobs, because I love Nathan Jacobs, and as he was working on the hiddenness of God stuff. But what exactly, where exactly are institutions? People for a long time have made the point that, did Jesus start an institution? Now that's a really Luke's going like this, and it's going like this, right on top of each other.
I think body is what the Bible says. I think that's what it says.
So so much of the emergent movement was, and I like what Sam eventually pointed to, which was Kale's idea. Kale was another guy that I thought, maybe I should get Kale in on this one. So, but Kale's not always available. And then CW came up in the comments. I thought, no, I'll get CW in on this. So, yeah, but Peugeot wins the straw poll, but of course,
just have to do my best to represent the Catholic position, Paul. So.
All right.
Against my nature, but
go ahead and play. Go ahead and play.
Well, the Emergent Church was originated within an institution and did mostly happen inside church boundaries. Whereas whatever the heck TLC is doing did not originate inside church boundaries, did not originate inside church walls. And there's no such thing as a TLC church, really, yet. Even Paul's church isn't a TLC church. And like, you're the most TLC person there is. So there is this very different, and a lot of that's because of the internet, that the internet completely changed the way that we connect with each other and how we find people of similar mind and spirit or whatever. And so that, I think, is really a big difference. And it does have to do with the intergenerational handoff and that being interrupted by technology.
There is a potential analog there, though, because one could argue that Paul's church, knowingly or not, is kind of sending him into the the field of the internet. But the interesting thing about that is, even if you could say that there's a sense in which that's true, that this is some missional aspect of Paul's vocation as supported by his local congregation, such as it is, I think that, you're right, Sam, that the mandate is not to plant a church necessarily. So then it raises this question of, well, what are we doing? And is this maybe an evolution that is compatible with the non-institutional ecclesiology I was suggesting? Although I would note that, a la John Calvin, there are many institutes of the Christian religion. So one can reject on an existential definitional level that the church itself is defined by its institutional organization or endeavors, while affirming and indeed even advocating for institutions and institutional activity.
It's kind of what Paul does with TLC.
Yeah, well, that's very provocative. It's like, that's an interesting question to me. Like, is that a viable area for Christian cultural endeavor? Like a kind of like, more conscious. Yeah, so something that emphasizes the existential relationships between people as inviolably church-ish, but then organizes them in a way in which that organization is radically incidental to their existential identity as brothers and sisters in Christ. Obviously, as somebody who used to read all the radical home church movement books and such, there's something very appealing to me about that possibility. But
one of the points, so we're discussing a little email correspondence for our event in Galway. And one of the things that I pitched to them was, it's really curious how the state churches, State Church of Ireland is Catholicism, of Spain, Catholicism, of France, Catholicism, of Italy, Catholicism. In the 20th century, these things go through, and before, these things go through radical things. The relationship between church and state and the Spanish Civil War was a key element of the Spanish Civil War. In Italy, the rise of fascism and Catholicism those two have a real integrated past. And of course, Vatican II sort of blows the lid off of it. But the rad trad, element to the RC today is super interesting in that regard, because Vatican II, they want to hold their nose, but how then does that play? And what's so interesting about the emergent movement is you see people, so this leadership net thing, I love how the podcast began talking about how churches would receive faxes once a month from this leadership network, which is so seekerish. And these would be all tips on how to do this and do that and do this and manage the parking lot and the volunteers and do surveys. And I mean, I saw that front row seat of all of that stuff. And of course, that so violates the emergent sensitivities and a lot of the ortho sensitivities now. But the emergent guys sort of, you have their rough draft being mega churches. And so when they start Solomon's Porch or Jacob's Well or Mars Hill, that's where they go from, as does Keller.
Mm-hmm.
And then, of course, the most interesting aspect about the emergent movement itself, especially after it calved off from the Young, Restless, and Reformed, is that they couldn't hold themselves up institutionally, which brings me sort of back to Luke's very interesting pitch because I think about this, when I saw this emergent thing, it's like, oh gosh, what are we doing here? What are we doing here? And why haven't we blown up? And, it was on the bus at Chino when we were traveling over to visit the Riverside Orthodox Church. Chad's sitting next to me on the bus, and he says, wouldn't it be great if we were all in the same church? And I said, Chad, it was amazing.
We are, Chad.
It was amazing in Thunder Bay when Catherine's brother serves communion in that conference. And I'm thinking, because the Catholics can't take it, the Orthodox can't take it, the Vervaeke tribe is just there wondering what the heck they should do. And it's just the Protestants.
They won't let me take it.
Sam can't take it. I don't know.
I think that one of the questions that really got sort of Luke's super secret sacred text chain going was the question of whether or not the TLC will fly apart in the same way the emergent movement did into somewhat predictable left and right wing directions. Now, the way that the left and the right wing looks in the emergent movement looks a little bit different than it would look in the TLC, right? Like, you can imagine Grail country-ish being the left wing of the TLC, even though left wing isn't really a fair and all-encompassing description of them, but it's still, we kind of know what we mean when we say that. And whatever the right wing is I don't know, maybe it's just Trip. But I think that we might be able to hold together a little bit better than that, but we also aren't in communion, like what you were saying, PVK. And so what's at stake is not a institution with confessions and a congregation taking communion together. And so
what does it mean to be in
not
communion?
At stake. Well, that's a great question, but I mean quite literally showing up to the same building once a week and taking the bread and the wine. But I also know what you mean at a deeper sense.
Yeah, this kind of like online group that we're all kind of a part of.
Paul and his heretics, I believe Tripp once said.
Yeah, that's fine. Whatever. But I mean, I think that and we were Luke, Sam, and Sarah and I were all talking about this. I think the thing that makes it so that we can have conversations is, one, we're all highly open on the Big Five. We're fine with that. But then also we're all fairly disagreeable. We're fine disagreeing with each other, but we're also open. So we can have this conversation, we can disagree with each other, and I can, tell Luke he's full of it, and that's fine. And we can just move on. But could we do more than that other than just have conversations, interesting conversations, and learn from each other? Could we have a local church? And I don't think we could. Like that's I don't think we could. Like we could not come together and actually have an institution. And I think that was the weakness of the emergent church, was that there was no cohesive thing that was going to keep it together. There was too much. It was
just
like
generational zeitgeist or something.
yes, it was a reaction against what came before. And so that's like, so now we have this new thing that we're all doing, but we don't really agree with each other and those kind of things. And that's where I do think that, like, going back to Pajot, I do think that that's where he shines and is, okay, I'm not trying to convince you to go with tradition because I told you to. I'm not trying to tell you to go with tradition just because this was a confession or something like that. I'm trying to show you that this is something that's actually deeply meaningful, and there was a reason that we got here. And I think that that's where, like, Pajot and Jordan Peterson are shining, and they're appealing to both liberals and conservatives in that way, because they're like, okay, the liberals don't like to just be told what to do, but the conservatives want to know that what they're doing is deeply meaningful and has a connection to the past and ancestors and all those kind of things. And I think that that's where they're kind of like meeting in the middle in a little bit of a way. But like the emergent church never had that. You had the young, restless, and reformed, where we're like, we're going to have smoke and mirrors, and we're gonna do all the new things. We're gonna do all the business ways of running a church, but we're gonna have traditional theology. And then you had the other side of the church that's like, forget the traditional stuff. Let's just get rid of all of it. And that's where they fit in more with the dying mainline. And I think that's what happened. And Pajot's kind of like, he's like threading a needle in a little bit for me, where I'm just like, I feel like you're appealing to both. And I mean, I like it. I love Pajot. I've got Pajot carvings in my house. I love him. So, but like, I think that's what's going on, is like, he's doing a little bit of both. And which is why we're all kind of trying to figure him out.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, when I came across, sorry.
No, you go.
When I came across Pajot, I had hit a wall of following one movement to the next and seeing how they continually broke up because there wasn't enough institutionalism, enough hierarchy. They would say we're together on these issues, and it would attract a certain amount of people, and then they would start a little group and they would name it something, and then it would just splinter off again. And so I got to the point where I was considering, and I was interested in church history at the time, studying that for the first time in my life because it was never taught to me, and learning about historical liturgies and things like that, and thinking in my mind, previous to finding Pajot, I think I can incorporate some of this. I can start reading, having readings in my very, just very vanilla evangelical Bible Belt church. I was the worship leader at the time. Like I can have responsive readings. I can start bringing in old hymns. I can do some of these things. Maybe we could even have candles. Like who knows? And I just finally realized that I'm just trying to do the same thing that all of these other people have been doing. And why is my version going to work? And why is anyone going to stay when someone's going to find an issue with why we shouldn't have candles, and then it's all going to blow up again? And so Pajot introducing the way that he approached traditionalism, I mean, Paul, I think you've always said he's trying to go back. I've never seen him as trying to go back, because Orthodoxy in America is obviously deeply influenced by all the Protestant converts. It's not the same thing. And yet there is this stability with the liturgy itself that is pretty incredible to me in my experience. I mean, from church to church, from country to country, I visited Orthodox churches all over the world, actually, at this point. So, and then the fact that it actually has not changed. I mean, in the wording, the music has, I mean, there are things that are flexible, but seeing all of these new movements bubble up and then fizzle out just gets exhausting.
So I want to, connected to that, I want to
point at what Sarah said.
Yes. I want to bring in.
Can we still point?
We can point. I'm going to point at it too, but I want to bring in media, because all the institutional stuff, when we're talking about institutions, you're talking about institutions that are rooted in books, in the written word. And I think the emergent church started when? At the beginning of the open use of the internet. And now we're in a
Yet
different mode of the
popularized
internet.
through publishing, Luke.
Yes, yeah, well, that's
The
still,
big
yeah,
guy.
but that's still happening. Of course, it's still happening. It's not going to go away overnight, and it's probably will never go away. And the liturgy, though, one of the big things about the liturgy and its constancy is it's a media. The liturgy is a media, and that's one of the big. Does it have words in it? Sure, it does. But TLC, the reason TLC works is because it's not confessional, which is rooted in literal institutions.
What do you mean works? What does work?
Literary.
Yeah. What does work look like for you, though? You're saying TLC works. Why does it work? What is work?
Manifests it all.
Doesn't splinter. It has distinctions without division, and people leave of their own volition, but it hasn't collapsed yet in the way the Emergent Church did. Maybe it will.
Yeah, I mean, I think the problem with making statements like that is that TLC is so multifaceted. Because so it's like, I mean, to me, like I hear you speaking to what I think of as maybe the majority aspect of the TLC, but nevertheless just an aspect of it, which is its like latently Christian aspect. But then there's also its outward looking aspect, where it brings in all this interesting diversity, some of which is, if not anti-Christian, radically ambivalent, maybe. But to speak to the latently Christian part, I wonder if it's not because we're not confessional, but because there's some sort of visceral sense of an implied, if not confession, conviction or Christian identification. Like that latently Christian part, I think, is very strong. And yeah, you're right. It's not confessional, but it's still there. And so in other words, if you scrutinized it, it would become confessional, maybe, if not inevitably, or at least it could. But I wanted to go back to something Sarah said, which I thought was really interesting. Like when she was relating her, like the effect of encountering Peugeot on her Christian experience and the kind of possibilities that engendered, it made me wonder if, and this might be weird to say, like if Peugeot is kind of like a C.S. Lewis-like character in the sense that he has a very apologetic edge to presenting a full-throated, very grand, sort of consistent Christian view. But for my purposes, what's interesting is that then gives people the confidence to engage in a variety of institutional contexts in maybe a way that I was alluding to before, where the organizational principles or the institutional infrastructure becomes radically incidental to their identity as Christian, and maybe even at the level of Christian thought, although more for Peugeot, maybe visceral Christian practice or expression. And that's really interesting to me, that possibility.
You can ask Rod Hare how long he's been asking me what I think I'm doing. Well, next week, I'm going to have a conversation with Van Donk, a Lutheran pastor, another CRC pastor, and an Anglican pastor that's going to focus on estuary as pastoral care. And I think if you had to locate estuary in terms of evangelism or pastoral care, it's more pastoral care than evangelism. Now, TLC is a little
group therapy, people.
Well, there's definitely a therapeutic element to it, but TLC is a little different in that it's way more chaotic. Now, of course, Father Eric, with his with the person who loves to agree with Father Eric, even though he doesn't go to church, to the best of my knowledge, Father Eric says there's no telos, there's no head, there's no boundaries to TLC, and I would say there's no head. There's no boundaries, but I think the incessant questioning about it is that we feel a telos, but we can't name it. We don't quite know what it is.
Yeah.
And I'm in the same boat. I do it because I see good fruit from it. Just in terms of ministerial instincts, it feels really healthy and right, because what I see is friendship, conversation, and this is very emergent. And, I see the quality of conversation between tribes that should be warring, and they're having good conversations about things. Not always. Sometimes they go off the rails, but lots of conversations go off the rails. I think the percentage of conversations that don't go off the rails versus the ones that do is better from what we've seen. Now, I'd also like to address what Sarah said, because when Sarah first talked about hierarchy, when I hear about hierarchy and the Orthodox in America, that's when I scoff, because there is no hierarchy. And Nathan Jacobs and I talked about that a little bit. And Luke likes to keep dumping on confessionalism. But I think what Sarah said about liturgy is really helpful, because I would say in many ways for the Orthodox, liturgy is their confession. And
it's like a misnomer.
They deal with liturgy confessionally in that sense, and the main line, because that's, I think, where you can begin to understand, let's say, the relationship between the main line and the Orthodox and these civilizational, but yet also, I would say, industrial Christianity institutions. Although what's happening to Orthodoxy in America is happening to the Orthodox Church, just like it happened to the Presbyterians and the Methodists, and the Baptists were never.
What do you mean by industrial?
Industrial institutions, it's just repetitive.
Well, it's I think CBAX, and so I just look at the Substack that I just posted. CBAX and Jordan Hall really nailed it in a little clip that CBAX made. And I think what Paul Kingsnorth is really railing against is not so much Christian civilization, but industrial Christianity. Because once Christianity is sort of industrialized, and that is deep, suddenly you start having to make decisions on behalf of the institution that is going to prioritize the health of the institution over some of the individual needs of people. And of course, anybody like myself, we make decisions about, and that's what happened to the Emergent Church by the Seeker Church. The Seeker Church said, no playing with theology. And the Young, Restless, and Reformed said, we're gonna double down on theology, but not exactly in sort of the thin evangelical way that, all of the evangelical churches cut and pasted their belief statements into 11 statements on their website. And then the others, the rest of the Emergent just exploded. But of course, they were in a confessional church container. But I think Sarah's point about liturgy in the Emergent Church was really important. And I think that sort of sets up then the Orthodox moment we're seeing.
So which branch of the Emergent Church do you think as having survived or thrived better? Like, because we have the different wings of it, right?
The Young, Restless, and Reformed beat the snot out of.
But where are they now? It's sort of like Wilsonian Christian nationalism is sort of like the only surviving wing of the Emergent Church, and the other ones just deconstructed, went mainline, and just fell off the woke slippery.
Right. Well, and Paul talked about it in a previous video. Like, a lot of these people just stopped going to church. Right. A lot of the people of that wing they're not even in church at all. Right.
And that's what happened in the CRC.
Because they weren't accepted. They couldn't.
I don't think that's true, but yeah.
Well, they couldn't. You see, in America, you can, and this is what all the Catholics and the Orthodox are always trying to shellac the Protestants on. In America, what do you need to start a church? But even the churches that the Emergent leadership, and these are some very competent leadership with a lot of experience, they couldn't hold it together. And what made the CRC take this turn that we've seen in the last few years was part of the CRC sort of went mainline Emergent-ish. Their kids didn't go to church, but Young, Restless, and Reformed people that wanted a little bit more freedom than you could find in the PCA come into the Christian Reformed Church, and when the votes are counted, it's 70-30.
Right.
I mean, I think you could argue that the Emergent Church still does exist. Like, if you listen closely to the podcast, like you will find that they emphasize that it originally began from this relationship between these people. And they were these really close cohort of friends. And you almost get the impression that, they were going to live, in other words, they were going to reflect on these kinds of things. They were going to push back against the strictures of the evangelicalism that formed them regardless. And that they were just trying to parlay this perhaps into the newest, greatest thing in evangelical movement Christianity. And that, that institutional, maybe pretense or agenda perhaps failed. But in that most basic primordial sense, they're still the same people and they're still doing the same thing. And even if, I don't think the lines can be drawn that easily, especially as it relates to these emergent folk. They haven't shunned, the people who went to the main line. They're all still friends. So, I mean, from their perspective, and in a way, it's very conservative. They never escaped this, clergy lay divide, that runs straight through the most experimental Protestant ecclesiology. Because there's a remnant, there's a church within a church. And I would argue that church within the emergent church, it's still there. And it's probably stronger than ever.
No, I agree with that. And this is one of the things that I always caution people in my circle about, because I've kind of gone the more high liturgy, I'm far more on the Anglo-Catholic, Orthodox, Roman Catholic spectrum now. But
I see by your background, Trip.
Yeah, exactly. This is me in the Vatican. I took this picture of the Vatican. And so I'm far more in that, but I also caution people that we kind of in our own online enclave where we talk to each other, we think that this is more common than it really is. And I do think that there's still an emergent mega church thing that they're the ones getting the people in the pews, not the are there more ortho bros? Maybe, but it's still it's not comparing to the charismatic evangelicals. It's just not they're still winning, and we need to stop pretending that oh no, they're it's not true. This is where I am, but that's not where most people are. And so I think that we need to be very, very, whenever we talk and we diagnose or we do a post-mortem on the emergent church, we need to be very, very careful, because post-mortem, if anything, they're doing better than the rest of the church.
I think there's
it is interesting. Go ahead, Sarah.
I think there's a real motivation too for a lot of us, and I wrestled with this question as well. We're tired of throwing off our parents' and our grandparents' traditions, and yet we feel lost because we don't know where to go. I mean, my parents were Presbyterian, and then they were weird charismatic woo-woo, and then they were Lutheran, and my grandparents were Methodist. So it's where do you go if you're trying to latch on to tradition? I would almost love to be cradle Catholic with generations behind me, because then you don't have to choose that. And I mean, even I was talking to my brother-in-law the other day, and he's wrestling with all of these same questions. And he's saying, well, he's really drawn to Orthodoxy, but he says, my mother was Catholic, not anymore. I could go to the Catholic church right down the road. And even though it's somehow tying back into my heritage and my tradition, but at the end of the day, I had to choose, where am I going to hitch my wagon? Because it's not clear. And
it's
so
a very Protestant ethic of you.
No, it is a very Protestant ethic. I mean, but it's what do you do when you have to choose?
Right.
So,
no.
Yeah.
I mean, Paul in one of his previous videos is Protestantism has infected all of Christendom. That's what's happened right now. And so now we all have to choose. And that's a very different position than like what the Roman Catholic official position is. It's very different than the Coptic churches and the Orthodox churches and everything else. Like we've all imbibed this because we're Americans. And like,
so I'm saying, so I hear this critique, and I've heard it a lot. Like, so if we're saying that the negative way to state this Protestant influence is that now we have to choose, is it possible to state it positively and say that now we can be self-conscious?
We get to choose? Yeah.
Well, but now we can be self-conscious in our theological application or our mode of practice. I mean, to me, it's like, how is this a bad thing? Like,
another really great addition to this conversation, in case it needed any more people, would have been Paul Anleitner, because Paul Anleitner is actually the right age. And he talks about this, post-ironic sincerity, right? Where we're exhausted by deconstruction and critical narratives and hermeneutics of suspicion. And we realize that at some level, there is no perspective from nowhere and etc. But that leaves us without any story. And then there's this kind of move to re-inhabit your own story, but with the awareness that you are choosing to do so.
What is that? That is authentic sincerity.
It's similar to going back, but it has this new extra layer of self-awareness, and that, if anything, is what the word meta.
But I do think that's where Pajot is trying to go with this.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
Like he's not just like saying believe this, imbibe these stories because I told you to, because the institution told you to. It's both that, but then also the institution is telling you to because these are deeply meaningful stories that are authoritative over your life. And I think that that's where he's trying to go, where it is a both and, like it's top to bottom. It's not like a dictatorial thing. And I think that's where like why he's like appealing to people. But I think that like, I think we all need to be aware that in America, we are all choosing. And that's not necessarily a good thing. Like, I don't actually think that like, I think that like, well, psychologically, I think that like people, if you go to a restaurant and it has too many menu choices, you are less likely to be happy with your choice. Like that's
Trader Joe's.
Yeah. Like it's not a good thing. And go to Cheesecake Factory. Too many options.
Well, it's a lot easier to accept your fate trip when you go to the Stalinist restaurant and the one thing is the one thing. Right?
Well, I mean,
you just have to manage your own psychology.
There is something to that, and then it can go too far. And so I think that's where we're trying to figure it out. And I think where the going back to the Emergent church, it was you had too many options. Right there, and it wasn't a cohesive whole. It wasn't something that was ever going to last, and so it broke apart. And it was inevitable that was going to do so. So, we can criticize the Roman Catholic.
I don't think it was inevitable. I wonder if part of the reason the Emergent Church formally failed is that remnant, that church within the church that was conducting this thing, decided that their project had failed. But then meanwhile, they maintained their cohort in more or less the exact same way they had always been doing. In other words, I wonder if they walked away from their people.
Well, you can look at it across the board. The ARP, the CRC, like the new influx. If there is an influx in any of these denominations, it's all the young, restless, and reformed people that are like finding another denomination. That's what's going on. They're leaving X29 and they're joining a CRC church or an ARP church or an Ortho Bro. Like that's what they're doing. Like that's just statistically what's happening.
If they're going to church at all.
If they're going to church. If they're not going to church, I mean, the rest of the Emergent movement, they're either not going to church or they're going to some mainline denomination that's dying. That's what they're doing. But like everyone else, every other denomination that's growing, they're pulling from the young, restless, and reformed group. That's what they're doing. I mean, and so that I agree with Paul when he says like the young, restless, and reformed, they won in the sense that they're the only people really going to church anymore. But like obviously Acts 29 wasn't what it was 10, 15 years ago, and it won't be. Like they're all moving into these other things. But like that's the ARP, that's the PCA, that's all these denominations. Like,
so is what CW said true, essentially, that like we're all just the same thing, we're just trying on different clothes?
I think there's a lot of truth to that.
Yeah.
But this again, so then you ask what TLC and estuary are about from my perspective.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I on the play yesterday, at the end of it, I read this piece that Bethel McGrew found on the Daily Wire conversation between Spencer and Jordan. And I made a tiny little video of it and added some branding, where basically the quote was, this dude got inspired. And I knew this was going to happen when I saw Peterson. This dude got inspired by Peterson, and he went and got a master's in philosophy. And he's like, I'm ready to play. And there's nothing. And so when I started this thing, it's like people are going to see Jordan and see Jonathan, and they're going to be ready to play. But they're going to be like, can I go to a church? Will my wife want to go to the same church as me? What about my kids? What am I going to do with them? I need someone to talk to. And that's why I started the meetup, and the meetups evolved into estuary, and the TLC grew out of that too. And it's why it is the shape that it is we need people to talk to.
Right. Do you think that that's has it been I mean, and I'm generally curious, like, is this like a pipeline then? Like, have you seen people like come to estuary first and then eventually get plugged into a church? Or are they still kind of on the periphery? Because I get it's hard, right? Because they have opinions. Like, institutions don't bend easily to independent thinkers. So
I think most are still, I mean, for some people, and Sherry says it at the Olympia conference, and she asked me on stage, I'm like, oh, Sherry, don't ask me that question. You know, is estuary church? I have my own institutional orthodoxy confessional line. Estuary is church adjacent. Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Because it is.
Mm-hmm.
And but at the same time, it is pastoral care, but it is also seeker oriented in that people in my estuary, they might not stay for 11 o'clock, but they're sitting in there with other Christians and with non-Christians. They're talking about this stuff. And a lot of them are like, I sort of understand the church a little bit better now. I never really had any idea what that thing was for or why anybody tolerated it. So it is having some impact. And it's very clear that the YouTube presence, the Peterson Peugeot, and to a degree, the PVK pipeline has brought a lot of people into church, because we saw that in the Discord, and I continue to get letters now that I'm going to church now. But even when we're in the Olympia conference, many people at that conference, because of this pipeline, have been going to church, but they're uneasy at church. And another video I have cooking is, there's a lot of people who are like, well, they've started going to church. And so maybe they're doing the liturgy if they're Orthodox, if they're going to Catholic, or they're doing the Mass, but they're still not quite sure what they're doing there.
Yeah.
Or
If I hadn't grown up going to church, and if I hadn't continually kept going to church, and I was a TLC person who had been pushed and encouraged to start going to church or what of basically whatever kind, I probably would have found it lame after a while, because I feel like almost none of my TLC self is very activated in an average church service. And I've been to a lot of different kinds of churches in the past couple of years, and that's true of all the different ones. And I feel like I'm operating on the older code that I know from childhood when I'm in those churches. And that if I were just there for TLC motivations, that I would probably get tired of it and not find what I was looking for, and probably burn out.
I guess that's a good, I think that's a good point, Sam. I guess two questions. One, should we want your TLC mode to be activated during church? And then two, like, if you've never had that kind of like background, how would we ease you into just letting that part of yourself go? If your answer to the first part is no, you don't need to be your TLC self in church, because that's not
if the sermon felt more like some of the podcasts that I liked, that would probably be true. But there is like a taste of the worldview gap is tasteable, noticeable between, say, the average sermon and a collection of your favorite TLC-ish sort of pseudo sermons or sermons. So I think that would help. And if most of the people there, I felt like I could connect with them like I do when I'm at a Chicago estuary meetup, whatever we are group. I felt like I had that sort of community. I would probably feel it that way, but I feel like I'm terrified to talk about TLC things in church. Part of that is just because it's me, but part of that is because, like, if I were to bring up Jordan Peterson or anything that could smack of something like that, it could have a really negative effect on a lot of relationships.
Okay, Sam, the reason all that is, to go way back to what's his name? The guy who was at your meetup a long time ago, started the BOM with Joey. What the heck's his name? Anderson. What's his name?
Oh, Tyler.
So
Now married with a baby.
Yeah. So Tyler said that a lot of what church has been is a masculine space with feminine language when it should be a feminine space with masculine language. And here's the thing, church, they tell you they want to know what you think and they want to have robust intellectual conversations, but bullshit, they don't, because they don't really want to know what you think. Because if they really know what you think, it might unsettle the literal basis of modern institutions and they will collapse, because all of a sudden you're going to get out of the groupthink and things aren't going to go well. So you can only do it here because we don't have those stupid confessional boundaries.
Well, which is
and
why
the people in the comments saying, I just want to go to a mass and I just want it to be blah, 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 blah. What you're basically saying is, I want to turn off culture basically of the church while I'm there altogether, so that so I don't go to a church with a conflicting culture to what I feel from my TLC culture. If I just
or you want to shut off your mind.
Right. Yeah. I want to shut off that so that I can still be full TLC and just like hear some songs and look at pretty paintings. But I think that most people still want something even more than just that.
Right. But Andrew Sullivan. So I want to go to my Catholic church. I want to be gay married. I'd love to be gay married in my Catholic church, but I can't. But I'm going to go to my Catholic church. I'm going to go to my mass. I'm going to pick my priest carefully because I'm a famous person. I'm going to get that done. And so everyone's mixing and matching. So Trent, this is where today's video, Trent Horn is my Protestant preacher, but I go to Catholic for mass and I'm a good Catholic. Well, where is Trent Horn in the hierarchy? And so what exactly is that Catholic church, or is CW finally right? And the Catholic church is just a parachurch.
I think there are at least two unexamined underlying assumptions that are crippling our ability to even talk about these things. And it seems to me that one of them we've already touched on, which is the almost ubiquitous and universal assumption that the church is to be unproblematically identified with an institution. And it strikes me that, regardless of the house church movement, emergent experimentation, TLC, yada, 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 that for many people is still very much live and controlling in their thought of what church is. So that's one of them. And then the other one, I think, is the capitulation or conflation of all Christian thought with theological hegemony or theological method, that there is no Christian thought apart from a theological mode of analysis. Well, therefore, you have to choose. You have to choose which school. You can't think in light of your Christian convictions until you've resolved that question. Well,
So
that's a big unresolved problem.
So shutting off your brain is not an option, and just going and doing the ritual.
It isn't if you're going to live out your faith. And this was my problem with the whole, and he's abandoned this now,
Seems
but this
important.
is my problem with the whole Vervaekeist religion that's not a religion. Because the obvious equivocation to me signaled, some cute polemic for something like religion without a theology. Well, that's very attractive to people until they want to think about it. what the hell am I doing? Why am I doing it? Well, that's, theology is helpful then. But so if you have this absolutist mindset that, that theology is not a pragmatic speculative device to help me make sense of what I'm doing in my religion, but it is the only way that I can approach religious thought, yeah, you get into this quagmire. And I see this in all these incoherences, even in this discussion. Like I see Tripp, who is like, in my mind, fixated on movement Christianity and who's up and who's down. Then meanwhile, he balks at the suggestion that the Emergent Church still has people they could serve. But look at Paul. Paul, who you love, Tripp, he's a failed pastor. He's a failed pastor who
with
has
ADHD.
not given up on loving his people. That's the difference. That's the only difference.
I think I figured out MJ's actually CW. MJ is a burner account.
This is so fascinating because you have successfully defeated a position I've never held. Like I do not think that Paul is a failed pastor in any way, shape, or form.
No, that's my view. That's my view.
Okay, well, that's not my view at all. So like that's you are arguing against a position that I've never.
I disagree with Paul about that too. Yeah.
No, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that at some point we are like abstracting out what does even the emergent church mean, right? Like we don't know. Like it is like we are like kind of it is a fuzzy term. We don't know like which churches belong as part of it, which ones don't. Like we don't know. Is John Piper part of the Emergent Church? Is Tim Keller? Is Mark Driscoll? Like if Rob Bell? Like okay, like we get it. These are fuzzy terms. That's fine. I think that we can all though agree that there was a thing that was happening in the mid 2000s to the mid 2010s that was different. That was outside of normal institutional bounds of denominations like the Presbyterian Church of America, the PCUSA, the Episcopal Church, the like Orthodox Church, the Roman Catholic Church, those kind of things. There was something different that was happening in a non-denominational bounds that was different. And there were different factions with them. And part of them like just ceased going to church altogether. Other ones joined more conservative denominations.
Again, a church institution. I mean, again, like you can't get away.
No. I'm sorry. I'm not going to play that game. Like no.
You have to.
There are church denominations. There are church denominations. I'm not going to like say that I'm a good Protestant. I
don't dispute that. I'm not trying to say that institutions.
No, so like I'm not saying the church denomination is the church writ large. That's not what I'm saying. What I am saying though is that there were like that movement within the church writ large, like had some spectacular successes and also some spectacular failures. And it's interesting. And we should think about like, why is it that some of them failed, some of them didn't, some of them never went.
Fair enough. And honestly, I think you're arguing against a position that I haven't advocated at this point now, because I agree with everything you're
okay, you better just let me talk.
I think the more interesting question is, what is institution for? So regardless of whether it's conflated with church, the reason that other question is important is because if people can't separate the institutional activity for the church from her existential identity as God's people, that question becomes a lot more all important, because now it's not just what is the institution for, it's what is Christianity for, Tripp?
No, I agree. So let me ask you, what is the institution for?
I don't answer.
What's their answer?
You go.
I think at the end of the day, someone has to make a decision. And you can say that you don't have a hierarchy or that you don't need an institution. But what it comes down to is that there are groups of people, and if you're trying to do anything organized, the buck stops with someone. And I think this is, I saw this happen in my own church that ended up splitting, and it was a question that I had as well. It's like, why are we appealing to this authority or that authority over another one? And I mean, they were trying to resolve a theological dispute, and someone was referencing, we're saying we're a Bible church, but someone's referencing Grudem, systematic theology, and someone else is referencing John Piper. And then at the end of the day, the head elder, who is supposed to be an equal, made the decision. And so, but why? And I think it just is a necessary part of being groups of people. Like, you have to have, and you can acknowledge it or you can not acknowledge it, but it's going to be there.
Yeah, I don't like that, because I think we all kind of came to the agreement that all institutions are inherently demonic before that.
No, you came to that agreement.
Yeah, but
literally no one else in this chat has agreed to that.
They're not perfect, but they're necessary.
Look, even
Okay.
the one who said that, Paul Tillich, was himself an institutionalist. That's
Okay.
worth noting.
Okay, but why all these things are failings? Because the biblical illustration most often used is body or a family. Why does a family fall apart? It's a failed leadership and it's failed hospitality. You can't colonize your children. It won't work. You don't actually make children. You can't. If institutions are doing that, they're demonic.
Well, I wonder what you guys think about this as a discussion point, and by way of answering Tripp's question. And I think
Also, I
agreeing
have
with
to go in
Sarah.
like 2 minutes, so.
Okay, well, I think agreeing with Sarah, who has to go in 2 minutes. I think the purpose of the institution is to carry out and facilitate the will of the church. And I think one of our problems is that in the case of Christianity, that's not monolithic. And that seems quite evident
No.
to me.
It is. What is the will of the church? What's the will of Jesus?
All right,
Let's go
we're
to John
gonna do
17.
takeaways, and because Sarah has to leave, she gets to go first. But someone has to just say papacy at this moment in this conversation. So go
All
ahead,
y'all
Sarah.
can say
Take away.
papacy.
What am I
Takeaways
supposed
from
to?
this
What am I
conversation.
supposed to say? Takeaway? Oh,
Yeah,
gosh.
take away from this conversation.
Oh, I don't know. That's tough. I think the more I talk to people, the more satisfied I am with my choice to do what I'm doing. Because again, coming back to the point that we do have to choose, I tried to choose the thing that I felt like I could pass off to my children and they could take it and raise their children that way for generation after generation. And if they don't, I think that the pursuit of wanting to follow Christ through all of this will shine through. And I think that's something that all of us probably were raised in homes, whether or not we followed in the footsteps of our parents, we did take on their passion for following Christ. And I think that's why we're seeking and why we are in a church, still attending church. And perhaps that's why the people who fell away are not going to church anymore. That's my takeaway.
All right. Thank you, Sarah. You can leave whenever you need to. Luke, takeaways from this conversation.
Receive with meekness the implanted word, which is able to save your souls. If you understand that, you understand everything.
Where's my Luke bingo
When
card?
was it implanted? When was when does it get planted?
When is the wrong question?
All right, there's Luke's takeaway. Sam.
I think that the TLC could be deeper and bigger in terms of what's going on than the Emergent Church was. I think that we can do, there are way bigger and deeper theological and philosophical and ontological even questions being asked in the TLC than I think the Emergent Church ever did, which was just like fixated on, like a very narrow version of Calvinist versus Arminianism or something like that, or, sexual ethics, basically. And that I think that there is actual work and progress that can be done and made by doing actual real theological work. And I think that that could be something like a telos for the TLC, should we choose to accept it.
All right. Good. Thank you, Sam. Trip, takeaways from this conversation.
I think my takeaway is mainly that we're and I'll go back to what I said about Jordan Peterson and liberals versus conservative at the beginning. Like, what we're really observing is the need for flexibility and individuality, and also the need for institutions. And what we're struggling with is, where does one go too far versus the other? And you saw the Emergent church go too far in one direction. We've seen other denominations go too far in other directions. And it either becomes totalitarian, or it becomes just this free-for-all nonsense machine that can't stay together in any kind of coherent way. And so we do, sorry, Luke, we do need confessions. We do need things that bind us. But then also, we don't need to be so stodgy and like rigid that we exclude people who would otherwise be on board with the larger mission that we're doing. And so, like, I think that's where we're all struggling a little bit. And that's where, like, just observing Young Restless Reform, Mars Hill, the Emergent Church, all these kind of things, that's where we're all just observing the ways in which they err that maybe we could do better in the future. But, like, we all have to admit that you can err in both sides of this. And it will either completely dissolve, or it will die like the stodgy stone case that you made it. Like, it's going to be one or the other if you don't like attend to both sides of it. And so that's kind of where I am. Like, and I think that's where, like, observing the Emergent Church movement, when I look at it in retrospect, that's what I see, is that it was not cohesive enough to last. It had its strengths, but it wasn't cohesive. And so I think that institutions are good. They can become oppressive, and we have to fight against both. So.
All right. Good. Thank you, Trip. CW, takeaways.
Yeah, I mean, especially because it's such a Pandora's box of things that, as is, I guess the cottage industry of the TLC, right? And as Luke likes to say, in talking about anything, we're talking about everything, right?
I accept that.
Thank you. So you accept my loving quotation, but so it is with this conversation. Like, I mean, I do think that I differ a little bit with Tripp in the analysis of the Emergent Church, but I would hasten to add that for me, it's like not that big of a deal. So in other words, like, I didn't see the Emergent Church as in any way vying for some sort of like proto-normative future Christianity or something. So to me, the fact that it fizzled out as a movement is kind of like neither here nor there, although I do know a lot of people who were profoundly affected by that. And my analysis of what happened there, even though it's a small subset of the broader Christian phenomenon and experience, is quite different. It seems to me that, and this is kind of a hot take that I've been percolating while I'm listening to everybody here, I wonder if it wasn't and this might sound weird, but like imperialistic pretense of the leaders that ultimately failed their people. Because, can you argue that it was incoherent? Yeah, it was too fucking incoherent to be a totalizing normative movement that took up the mantle of all cultural Christianity. And to the extent to which that's what Tripp's saying, I completely agree. However, it was not too incoherent to serve its people. And a lot of those people are here in the TLC now. And I will just clarify that, like, I think while Paul may have failed as a pastor by all worldly objective standards, presiding over what is now, I think, a dying church, he is a tremendous success.
Got a bunch of new members coming in. I got to watch what I say.
Okay, well, you're on the upswing now, Paul. Ride the wave, right? Go Rick Warren, go all in. But I think he's a tremendous success as a pastor in the existential truest sense, because he hasn't abandoned his people. And honestly, when I look at the Emergent Church, all due respect to them, they abandoned their people. And it's not because they went away, and it's not because it was too incoherent for them. It's because they couldn't steer the ship of cultural Christianity, so they gave up. That's my view. But
wow, I think that's it. I'm really persuaded by that, CW. I really am. I'm so glad you decided to come. Now I got a bunch of people backstage, and StreamYard is saying that other people have tried to get backstage and couldn't. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bring the backstage people one at a time in, and I'll leave the ones in, but then I'm going to sort of have fishbowl rules. So if you're, if you can leave, go ahead and leave. I'm going to priority to the main panels, but so those of you backstage, just be a little patient. I'm going to bring you in one at a time to say their thing, and then we'll continue the conversation that way. Christian Baxter, what say you? What do you have to say about this thing that we just did this morning?
TLC will last if we accept the incohesion as a feature, not a bug. I think that's the, shout out to Peter Rollins and the Church of Contradiction, Luke, and such. I don't know. The thing that makes me think of is just like the end part that CW was making, and even the contrast that trying to shift culture and then make this into an actual thing, as opposed to this is where the story comes up and then it comes back down. Everyone has to come into the digital space and come back down into the embodied space. And YouTube is a place where things have happened. And Emergent Church didn't happen on YouTube. It happened in the blogosphere, like was mentioned earlier, and it happened in the publishing. This is happening and happened on YouTube. Jordan Peterson happened on YouTube. Peugeot happened on YouTube. Paul Vanderklay happened on YouTube. And so like Paul's thing about, his success and not, I said this in the comments, but his success was not, he failed by metrics of scale. But if you talk about scaling over here, I think it is tending and grow. It's still growth because it's been pushed to be scaled. And that's a feature, not a bug, I think, as well. I remember one time Alan said, responding to Paul, he said something like, should I keep doing randos? And he said, if not for just simply the sake of example. And I'll won't forget that, because that's actually a feature of culture. It's not just a feature of nostalgia. It's actually like a feature of a culture. And so anyways, I think those are some of the things that hit me initially. And yeah, that's all I got.
Where are you here?
Oh, there I am. Hey.
Where are you? Where?
Got me?
Oh boy. Yeah. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me.
Come on, man.
Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. All along this Jesus journey. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. Yeah.
Walk with my mama.
You walk with my mama.
Walk with me.
Walk with me too.
You walk with my mama.
Yeah.
Walk with me.
And walk with me too.
Oh, my.
Yeah.
Jesus
journey.
I want Jesus.
Want Jesus.
Walk with me.
Walk with me. Hold my hand, Lord. Hold my hand. Hold my hand, Lord. Hold my hand. All along this Jesus journey. Hold my hand, Lord. And hold my hand.
Walk with Moses.
You walk with Moses.
Walk with me.
Walk with me.
You walk with Moses. Walk with me.
Walk with me. Jesus' journey. I want Jesus to walk with me.
Say, walk with me, Lord. How y'all doing? Walk with me. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. Walk with me. I'm on my yeah, I want Jesus. I want Jesus to walk with me. To walk with me. Walk with David, a little shepherd boy. Yeah, you made him a great king. I know David shouted for joy. You walked with David, and he's a little shepherd boy. You made him a great king, and David shouted for joy. That's right. Oh, yeah. So walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. All along this Jesus journey. Walk with me, Lord. Walk with me. Gotta walk with me, Lord.
Yeah! That was rocking great, brother.
Oh, yeah.